Limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is more feasible than you think. We just need to go beyond for sustainability, accelerating the energy transition, deploying green tech at scale, decarbonizing entire value chains, and leave no one behind. Welcome to Beyond the Scope, a sustainability podcast that goes beyond the obvious in support of positive and collective climate action.
Hello, welcome to episode 2 of Beyond the Scope of Net Zero Buildings with Schneider Electric. My name is Sumit Bose. I'm the founder of Future Net Zero. It's my pleasure to host this session. Today we've got two fantastic guests who are going to take us into the world of buildings, the world of decarbonising the things we live in, the offices and the places we work in. What are we going to do? Do we have to pull them all down? Do we have to renovate them? We're going to cover that today. Delighted to join us from Schneider Electric. We have Rémi Pacau, who's Director of Sustainability Research. Bonjour, Rémi.
Bonjour.
And we have an expert on net zero buildings, Victoria Burrows, who's Director of Advancing Net Zero from the World Green Building Council. Tell us more about it, Victoria.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And well, the World Green Building Council is a network of national green building councils all over the world. There's one in France, there's Alliance Ashcure. There's also around 70 members of World Green Building Council at a national level who then have collectively about 36,000 members working in the building and construction sector. And you're quite right. My job is to achieve total decarbonisation of the built environment by 2050.
So people don't know, are these constructing companies? Who is a member of the Building Council?
That's a great question, Sumit. We have representation across the entire value chain. So everything from investors through to manufacturers and heavy industry. We have large companies with enormous global portfolios, and we have individual members. And anyone who really has a part to play in and has a real kind of vested interest in ensuring a more sustainable built environment, they're welcome to be part of the network.
So that they can be sort of governmental bodies as well as just commercial companies then?
Yeah, so the way that we partner with the different organisations will depend on what sort of organisation they are. Many green building councils have a fantastic relationship with their local governments, with cities, with regional governments, and also with the national governments. And they do a lot of advocacy work and sort of respond to some of the calls for content that they put out and consultations. Others get involved with other non-profits within their markets to collaborate on putting out different thought pieces and leadership articles and things like that, because that's what we need is collaboration across the sector. And World Green Building Council partners with organisations like the World Resources Institute, the Global Alliance of Buildings and Construction, the Business Council for Sustainable Development, and the WBCSD.
How many members, like in terms of nations? It says world globe. So how many countries have members as part of your group?
So we have about 72 at the moment, national green building councils. Some of those represent some of the largest nations by population, like the US and Australia and some countries in Asia, including China, of course, and India. But some also are smaller green building councils that represent where we're expecting to see huge amounts of growth over the next few years. So equally as important to have GBCs in those countries too.
Such as, where are you talking about, smaller nations?
I was expecting to see a lot of growth in Africa and in Southeast Asia. We'll get onto this in a moment, but we have that massive dual problem of how do we continue to build and deal with our existing building stock. And depending on where you are in the world, that proportion will vary slightly.
And Rémi, you sort of run sustainability research then. So let's talk about the Sustainability Research Institute. What are you finding out there?
Yeah. So as you said, we're a part of the sustainability research. So we are producing and publishing research. We are an internal think tank within Schneider Electric, focused on climate change and energy transition. And we produce and publish mainly, for business communities, but also for societies, for governments, in order to try to paint a way for a sustainable future. So my current research is mainly focused on buildings and cities transformation, and especially decarbonization.
I'm assuming very few buildings globally are sustainable. It must be way less than 1%, because this is a very new thing anyway. So the challenge is pretty much everything is not sustainable right now. That I'm living in a house here in London, where I'm recording this from, which is built in the 1930s. But it's a massive thing, isn't it, for us globally, to try and take buildings from where they are to where they could be.
And I would also say to that point, Summit, that the scope has changed, right? I mean, in the past, we've been focused on how much energy buildings use, the operational performance of energy. And now we're also thinking about the embodied carbon and materials that go into those buildings. Yes, there are city centre developments that are the highest possible performance, but they might not have adequately considered embodied carbon. Equally, I've stayed at Fanan Eco-Lodge in the desert in Jordan, which is entirely powered by renewable energy by virtue of its location and where it is. So I think you'd be surprised, actually. There's quite, by necessity, quite a few buildings that are performing optimally. But you're right, far more that are performing way below par, way lower than they should be. And we're allowing that by codes, right? They're allowed to be built to that level of performance.
Who works at your research institute, Remy? Have you got scientists? What sort of people are looking into this sustainable research?
We are an internal team of Schneider Electric, but we rely on the either experts from Schneider on different topics, whether they are technological topics or other, and also on external partners, because a lot of information, a lot of data and facts are already worked by external bodies. So we rely a lot on them. And this is really helping us, to have an independent view of things and to make research studies which are, let's say, independent and producing things which are, let's say, trustable for the stakeholders.
When we look at buildings now, I mean, we've globally shifted energy, right? It's shifting, it's moving. Everyone can see that. We're starting to shift transport, EVs, etc. We may start to shift shipping. What sort of impact are we having right now in terms of the buildings we live in on CO2? So what sort of emissions could we say percentage-wise are buildings giving the planet?
I think we all know that buildings can play a key role in combating climate change. But if you want the back of my mind, I think we are somehow in a kind of deadlock, because we know that buildings represent globally a big percentage, 30% of total CO2 emission when we exclude the embodied emissions. And we know that we have big challenges, to reach the net zero by 2050 for the world, to be on a path consistent with a global warming trajectory, compatible with the 2015 Paris Agreement. But we know at the same time that we have all the existing technologies to cut at least 70% of the emissions now, and thus decarbonize massively now. So I feel that we have a huge opportunity, but in our research, we feel that there is not enough a sense of urgency. It's still missing. We saw that, in the COP26 with a lot of good commitments, we are progressing. Yeah. We saw that also in the outcomes from the IPCC assessment report, the sixth one, which was released a couple of months ago. So we know that we need to change, right? But 2022 was supposed to be a year of clear acceleration. And what we see in our industry is that the pace at which the transition is engaged is dramatically slower than what most scenarios require. So from our study, in fact, what we have determined is that at current pace of change, it is likely that the entire 1.5 carbon budget will be consumed as early as 2030. And this is converging with the IPCC study. So I think we have big opportunities. We have a lot of movements, but overall, it's not decarbonizing fast enough. So the whole question for me is, how do we accelerate the modernization of this building economy?
You said 70%. That's a massive amount. You think 70% could be got rid of with technology available today. What sort of technology are you talking about?
Yeah, sure. It's to have local energy production, clean energy at least. Mainly for buildings, what we recommend is rooftop solar, because it is for us the best technical economic equation for local production of energy. We believe we need really to foster the investment on active energy efficiency. Technologies are very industrialized now. It is really at cost. So we can manage to have industrialized solutions and leverage what we can provide now in terms of heat electrification. Technology has really progressed in the last decades and years. It's progressing every day. And our strong belief is that when we combine the three of those, active energy efficiency, clean electricity, and heat electrification, we can have a massive impact on decarbonization, up to 70% for some buildings. It's more complex than that, for sure, because we have different buildings. It's very fragmented, but this is what we are publishing in the study.
And what about storage? Is that going to be very much part of this equation from your research, that people have to have batteries in their properties? New builds here in the UK are having batteries put in for exactly this sort of stuff. What's your thinking around that, Remy?
Yeah, it has been integrated, but we didn't push too much as technology still, need to be at scale in terms of industrialization. And what we worked on also is on thermal storage, which is for services building very interesting and promising.
For your members, Victoria, why aren't they doing it?
Remy is absolutely right. The technology exists, right? And it's proven, and there are buildings around the world that are demonstrating this. The real challenge, and you touched on it very briefly, is the fragmented sector. So it's not a case of just waiting for regulation to force you to do this, right? And it's not the case of an architect can design whatever building they want, and then the engineer's responsibility is to make that building net zero. And when we're talking about existing buildings, yes, it's a simple equation in terms of the sorts of technologies and approaches, but there is no one single solution that will work for every building. In a cluster of buildings in the city centre in London, you'll need to do lots of different audits and understand exactly what the right combination of solutions and measures are for that building. And that can be disruptive, right? Especially when you've got people in the building. We need to make sure that you're doing it within maintenance cycles, so you're not kind of throwing out equipment before it's sort of ready to be replaced. It's a very complex challenge, and that's why we're really not optimizing it at the moment. What we're seeing is this concept of the ambition loop in action. Once you set a target and you look at what it would take to get to that target, then as Remy says, the technologies are available. They're less costly than some people might perceive. And so if you're really asking the right questions, then you can start to get the right solutions. And the more that governments see more companies taking those steps, the more confident they are to start setting higher and more ambitious regulations to start requiring this stuff to be considered at the design stage. Because as we've mentioned, buildings are being built today way below the standards that we know are possible. And all those buildings are going to need retrofitting in the future. And we know that's a big challenge.
So we're not doing it the right way right now, even with new buildings.
Absolutely, even with new buildings. I think it comes down to complexity because, again, there's not one single policy that would solve this entire challenge. I mentioned about where we're expecting to see development over the next few years. In most of those countries, Summit, there aren't any energy codes at all for the way you build buildings, let alone energy codes that are not the level of ambition we need to see. So there's some tools that World Green Building Councils are producing and some resources like the roadmaps that they're producing for national level to say, for example, the UK had one published last year. So is the French Green Building Council to say, here's what needs to happen compared to our current baseline, whatever the local codes demonstrate or require now. And it gives me a little bit of hope that we could make this enormous shift. So it's a long process. It's an industry that's notoriously resistant to change, and we're asking them to completely change the way that we design buildings. So these roadmaps and tools are helping make it easier to do the right way than to choose not to. And one of the biggest changes we're seeing in the sector is this mindset shift.
We are talking to a global audience here, and I'm aware that, everything we've said so far is great. If you live in London or Australia, you live in the States. But what about the developing nations? What about smaller nations? What about nations who are poorer? And how can they join? So what is happening, A, from your point of view, Remy, in your research, when you've looked around, how can the developing nations get in on this? And B, from your point of view, Victoria, what are your members in the smaller countries? How are you going to try and influence them? Remy, let's talk about the research side of things. Where do you see all of that?
No, it's a great question. And I think, there is a kind of general consensus that innovation and technology could help over time. But the magnitude of the transition is such that it often faces issues, and typically in emerging countries. So I think one of the key challenges here is to change, the perception of decarbonization. And to start to change this perception, you need to make people, the business stakeholders, the public stakeholders, all the stakeholders in these areas, to make them conscious that, in fact, doing good for carbon reduction is also good for their business, for their resiliency, for their community, for themselves. And then the change is happening. So what we are really trying to focus on is to say, we see in some decarbonization circles or climate change technology circles that we push the debate back to the next innovation 10 years from now. But the reality in these countries is that the next 5 to 10 years are far more important, until 2030 than the one after. Because everything we build or renovate, which is not sustainable now, will not be sustainable for the next 50 years. So every decision we make is counting really now. So I think for these emerging countries, the current pace of economic growth and population rise will lead to a doubling of global building floor space from new construction over the next 40 years. So solutions in these cities rely more heavily on retrofit strategies, whether they are small or big retrofit strategies, as 80% of the buildings that are needed by 2050 are already in existence in 2022. From a research and technology perspective, the key challenge is to ensure that the business, so the technologies, the value chains, the business models are fully adapted to be prepared for this massification at the lower cost possible for the society.
And Victoria, for your members that are in the smaller ones, and obviously I'm sure you want to recruit more nations, what can they do?
We can learn a huge amount from the 20 years that World Green Building Council has been around and longer that this movement has really been around for. And yet we know that policy still isn't where it needs to be. And so there's a lot of benefits or a lot of kind of good positive learnings that can be taken from some of that process. And yes, there's a cost implication, but if you're focused on investing in kind of green features or technologies that go into a building that actually don't benefit the building in the long term or hasn't adequately adjusted whole life carbon, you're investing in the wrong place. So, understanding that scope and understanding what areas need to be addressed is a real, I think, positive thing coming out of the process so far. And that's really the power of a global network like ours. So what we are seeing is a greater recognition of performance-based metrics, making its way through policy, and also into investment and finance decisions. So green funding is being linked to how the building actually performs rather than how it was designed or built, because then that addresses what's known as the performance gap. That is just a huge shift in mindset that should mean that buildings are built right in the first place and we don't have to go back and renovate them as much as possible. And so increasing that understanding, increasing that buy-in, linking it to finance is really powerful. We know that, the smaller nations are those the most affected by climate change and, the most vulnerable. And yet their emissions are so much lower than everyone else's because they're used to being resilient, used to sourcing materials locally, used to kind of building within their means, frankly. And where we're at is that we're building beyond our means. So thinking about all that new development we talked about will also require new infrastructure. And that means concrete, that means steel, that needs the heavy industries to decarbonize production of those materials. Because if we can, as Remy said, decarbonize operations, it's only a small dent actually in the problem. We need to be also supplying lower carbon alternatives to create this infrastructure as well.
I want to touch briefly on something you said, Remy, about retrofitting. And, as I said, here I am sitting in England and I have an office. It's a 1950s office. And everyone knows that retrofitting would be the right thing. The UK government has just made a big push on it. Other nations around the world are talking about this. What's holding back retrofitting?
Yeah, I think, many people often underestimate good retrofit for sustainability and carbon reduction can actually make you economically more performing. It is, again, I think, the question of the perception and thus the adoption of decarbonization.
So do we have to force people? Is that what we need? Legislation, politicians to force landlords to change?
Yeah, I think it's a part of the equation, but basically prior to that, to the policy, to the incentive or to the regulations, there is still the question of how you make much visible the value creation from decarbonization investments. And traditional financial outcomes have historically driven investment decisions in the building ecosystem. Many industries leaders are increasingly recognizing non-financial consideration and often include outcomes such as environmental, social impacts in building construction, valuation, and even retrofit and acquisition. So what we tried to do and what we published as a research in February this year was a result of a work we did with the World Economic Forum around the building value framework, which is aiming to give a very, very practical pathway with a list of 9 points. And based on the research we did with the World Economic Forum and a consortium of stakeholders from investors, finance sphere, but also design firms and also OPEX leaders. You were talking about asset managers or property manager. It's a difficult equation to crack, clearly, but we think this is where we need to put efforts on. Because more or less, I think on the commitment side, many, private or public companies are taking now commitments, strong commitments, and they're supported by typically World Green Building Councils, which is providing frameworks in terms of what is a strong commitment for net zero buildings. We have quite a lot of elements on the verification side. So, all those labels, the certification, trying to extract the value of investment. But for us, there was something missing in between, which is what is the practical things that will make the people take the right decision at the right moment. But I mean, in an action mindset.
I suppose the thing is, maybe you've got to start positively. Or maybe the thing is you go, right, the bigger companies start to do it, the new model, and eventually it gets down to the level of where my landlord is, who suddenly either has to do it because he can't operate anymore. Do you believe that this needs a push and a pull? So you need private and you need public sector. So you need governments, you need public sector, because government can say, right, all our schools need to be this way, our hospitals. But you need companies like yourself, Schneider, and your members, Victoria, to go, right, we're going to build it, and we're only going to build this way. And we are going to do the 70% that we could do right now, instead of going, let's just do 20%. So where are you both on that public-private sort of need for working together?
In the study that we worked on, what we find is that the economic equation is a no-brainer, mainly for commercial or service building stock outside retail. So both for retrofits and new builds. So mandates to adoption appear here as an obvious route in decarbonization, which maximizes value and creation for all. The equation is more complex in residential. So we need really to be careful on that because the stakes are quite different. I think what we should recommend is to split incentives. For example, for building owners versus building dweller are probably one of the largest barriers to adoption. Regulation and mandates can help alleviate some of these issues. I think there is also a point of availability of competencies in the right value chain. It's fundamental, for operating net zero buildings. That would be my two comments. Quite a huge opportunity on commercial, splitting incentives and taking care of having the right skills, to operate the building to reach the net zero targets.
So I would say there's a real tension, but also opportunity between supply and demand. And that's something that private sector and public sector have in common, right? Because public entities, cities, governments, they are massive asset owners themselves, and they have public procurement strategies. And, as we were talking about earlier with heavy industries, there'd be no better signal to the concrete sector or the steel sector than things like the Buy Clean Act, where they say we will not buy these materials from you anymore if you don't decarbonize the production processes to supply us with lower carbon alternatives. Equally, Summit, what happens if you say to your landlord, well, actually, I'm not going to renew the lease if you don't implement these measures? It's not a down the road sort of thing. He potentially wouldn't be able to release that space if others think the same way as you. So that's what I mean about the supply and demand, right? If he's not able to supply a space that is efficient, that meets the demand of what we're now seeing from private sector, then he simply won't be able to lease that space. And it's not a case of whether he'll save money or not, it's whether that property is worth anything in the future. And, companies might snap up poor performing buildings and improve them, but he will lose money as a result of that. And that's a choice he's making. So there's that real push and pull, as you mentioned, and it's across all those different sectors, right? It's between public and private, but it's also within the dynamics internally within those frameworks. And we really just have to create both those demand signals, because landlords won't magically say, oh, you know what, I think I need to install, I need to make those choices. Where there are net zero spaces in city centre locations, or even, not in city centre locations as people are moving out of cities, they're getting snapped up.
As you said, people are changing, right? So my generation, we like the environment, but not in the way that young people do now. They live and breathe it.
It's actually really interesting you say that, because we're hearing from companies who have signed commitments, who are making CSR a really significant part of their business, because people who are coming to interview for them will say, they'll ask them about their CSR credentials, right? They'll ask them about their strategies for achieving or supporting the SDGs. People will choose to come to a company and factor that into their decision making. And if you can really embrace this in a way that's positive for your business, it will also be positive to the people for your business too.
Before we go, I mean, look, there's a massive potential. You said it right at the beginning, right? 30% of global emissions, you said, are from buildings. Everyone's moving to more cities, right? We know that that's the global population shift is happening, so that cities are growing all over the world, and that's happening in Africa, that's happening across Europe. You can see all of that. What do you think, let's end on a positive, right? Let's end on a positive. What do you think, the future will be in terms of kind of building decarbonisation? And what do you hope to see in the next, let's say, 5 years that will really shift the dial?
I think we need to prove and to make explicit that decarbonization of buildings come at a net saving for building dwellers. If we organize things well between technology, value chains, policies, competencies, and so on. So I think this is important to keep in mind and to believe in, I would say. The second point is that there is a strong economic case, notably in new construction and services building. In residential, we will have to boost, I would say, all the aspect on investment from public sector, because there is this question of energy justice and low income houses. So I would say for service and new construction, we have something great to do quick. And if we take stock of the potential of the modern technologies now available, we know that a combination of those offer 2/3 or above carbon abatement opportunity by 2030. So it's now, it's not in 10 years, it's not a new technology, it's now, it's ready. It could generate massive savings on annual energy spend for building dwellers. And it could also bring additional, let's say, extra value, which is not only financial. I would say that there is a clear route towards successful and overall positive decarbonization of building stock. I think the economics are becoming more and more obvious on this topic. The important point will be to take care of not leaving aside lower income categories of the population who ultimately suffer the most from high energy bills. We know that in Europe, 50 to 100 million people would face what the European Union calls energy poverty. In the United States, it's out of the 15 million low-income households.
And Victoria, your concluding thoughts?
I think ultimately this is all about a mindset shift, right? We've heard the technologies there, we've heard the business cases stacking up. People are still choosing to build bad buildings, and that's just wrong. We have to always be thinking about, can I renovate an existing building as a priority? Think about prioritizing renovation over building new. And we have to make sure that all design teams are equipped with the right decisions or the right data in order to make decisions and inform decision making around the carbon budgets of projects, not just the financial budgets, but if I make this decision on, this curtain walling system or this fancy lighting system, what is the impact on the carbon budget? Where do we source it from? What's the replacement look like? Does it have to come from the other side of the world, right? And there are all of these considerations that have to happen when thinking about new buildings and new projects, but also to Remy's point, how do we optimize the cash flow into existing buildings to improve them? We simply can't have a world where a handful of corporate companies have the highest performing buildings in the world, and yet millions of people are in energy poverty. That is not equitable, and we have to solve both at the same time.
Remy, Victoria, thanks very much for joining us on this Beyond the Scope.
Thank you.
This has been Beyond the Scope, a sustainability podcast brought to you by Schneider Electric and supported by its Sustainability Research Institute. If you liked this episode, you can listen, subscribe, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts for more. The content of this podcast is for information purposes only and should not be undertaken as financial, economic, legal, business, tax, or investment advice. The information, statements, views, and opinions should not be construed as the provision of advice by Schneider Electric or as an offer to buy or sell any products or services or to make or consider any investment or course of action.